On March 11th, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck. Control rods were inserted into the reactor's cores. This procedure stops nuclear fission and is known as scram. But the temperature inside the reactors remained high at 300 degrees Celsius. Workers in the main control room had to quickly cool down the reactors. That was the only way to prevent the nuclear fuel inside from melting down. Rapid cooling could damage the reactors, so the operators turned the cooling system on and off at intervals. Up to this point, the cooling operation had proceeded according to plan, but things would soon take a sudden turn. "51 minutes after the quake,
S2 全交流電源喪失。時間は15時37分。全員確認して了解。メタクラパワーセンターに異常事象、電源が供給されていません。了解。時刻電源喪失の原因確認。了解。猪木の状況は RCIC の通電確認。 RCIC コスト圧力上昇。了解。 RCIC 無視だ。
Only the emergency lights for Reactor 1 remained on.
使える照明器具を集めて。了解。
Just then, a worker from another building rushed in.
やばい。海水が流れ込んできている。
A massive tsunami, more than 13 meters high, washed over the plant. The waves submerged a power panel at Reactor 1, cutting off electricity from the emergency diesel generator. Water also poured into the basement. Seawater flooded the emergency batteries. Now every source of power was lost. What happened to the reactor's cooling system?
イソコン3 A 弁ランプが消灯。運転状態確認できません。
Reactor 1 is equipped with 2 isolation condensers for emergency cooling. Hot steam from the reactor cools and condenses as it passes through a tank filled with water. Once activated, the system will keep working without power. But workers had been operating the machinery at intervals. The system happened to be idle when all power was lost. From that point on, the reactor quickly headed into meltdown. When the tsunami hit, water filled the reactor to a depth of 4.4 meters above the nuclear fuel rods, or top of active fuel. The water level rapidly began to fall. In the confusion, the operators in the main control room did not realize that the isolation condensers had been turned off just before the blackout. They would normally check whether the system was working by looking at indicator lights above the lever. But when the power failed, those lights went out too. Was the emergency cooling system working or not? Operators in the main control room could not tell. 350 meters away in the quake-proof building, a false perception was spreading among officials. They mistakenly believed the condensers were up and running. Plant manager Masao Yoshida was supervising the overall crisis response. At his side was Masatoshi Fukura, a unit leader in charge of reactors 1 through 4.
Mr. Fukura, you assumed the isolation condensers were running even after the power outage.
Yes, that's what I assumed. I thought they were working.
Officials mistakenly believed for quite a while that Reactor 1 was safe. This is a fax sent from the quake-proof building to the Japanese government. In it, TEPCO officials report that the isolation condensers were operating about 5.5 hours after all power had been lost.
As we explained before, the isolation condensers are up and running at Reactor 1. The water level is reportedly within a safe range.
But at 9:50 p.m., as government officials held a news conference, Reactor 1 was already on the verge of melting down. Why did workers at the quake-proof building think the isolation condensers were operating? A senior TEPCO official agreed to talk to us for the first time. He says it never occurred to him that the isolation condensers were idle, because they can run without electricity.
The isolation condenser is, in a sense, a static, non-electronic device that requires no mechanical revolutionary motion whatsoever. So, even now, I think it is extremely effective. At the time, everybody, including me, was hoping that it was doing its job.
TEPCO officials were unable to prevent a meltdown in Reactor 1. But our investigation reveals they could have noticed early on that the emergency cooling system had stopped. At 4:41 p.m., 1 hour into the blackout, the batteries temporarily recovered. Gauges showing water levels inside the reactors came back on.
1号機、水位見えました。タフプラス2500。時間は16時41分。了解。
水位は低下傾向か。
スクラム直後に比べて下がっています。
イソコンは動いているのか止まっているのか分かりません。
The water level was 2.5 meters above top of active fuel. It had dropped nearly 2 meters in just 1 hour. The rapid drop prompted operators in the main control room to suspect the isolation condensers were not working. Operators immediately relayed their information to the emergency headquarters in the quake-proof building. In one corner, workers began calculating what would happen to the reactor if things continued at the current rate. This is known as a progression prediction. NHK has obtained a communication log from that time. It reads, 1 hour to top of active fuel. This means the emergency response team had received a shocking prediction. The reactor core would become exposed in just 1 hour. But this information later became buried amid other data and was never used. Multiple reactors were now in crisis. Plant manager Yoshida received more and more data.
Important information kept coming in. We wanted to make sure the plant manager, the commander, got every bit. Members of each team had to wait for their turn to report to him. That was the situation we were in. When multiple accidents on such a major scale occur at once, it's extremely difficult to share information with everyone concerned.
At 4:44 p.m., workers had another opportunity to notice that the isolation condensers were not working.
そこの稼働状況？豚の鼻から蒸気が出てる？了解。免震塔から連絡。発電班が豚の鼻から蒸気発生を確認したそうだ。
The pig nose refers to two ducts. They allow steam generated by the isolation condensers to exit the reactor building. People began questioning if rising steam meant the isolation condensers were working. A TEPCO employee dispatched from the quake-proof building confirmed the presence of steam. Officials there continued to believe that the emergency cooling system was working.
We got reports saying steam was rising from the reactor building and that the isolation condensers were on. That's why I assumed they were running. I thought if they stopped, I would probably be informed. That's the kind of assumption that was going through my head.
Workers at the site testified that the steam they saw at the time was faint. That, in fact, was a major sign of trouble. What does steam discharged by a working isolation condenser look like? The United States is the leading producer of nuclear power. The 9 Mile Point nuclear station was built at around the same time as the Fukushima Daiichi plant. Every 4 years, its operators put the isolation condensers through a startup test. They say every worker knows what happens when the emergency cooling device is turned on.
When the emergency condensers are initiated, it takes whatever energy is in the reactor and just boils water.
These photos were taken 3 years ago during a startup test. Instead of being faint, a thick cloud of steam engulfs the whole building.
There's a ton of steam, and it sounds loud. I mean, it's a big rush. So it'll scare you. It'll knock your socks off if you're not prepared for it.
U.S. operators say faint steam emerges 2 to 3 hours after the isolation condensers are turned off. Reactor 1 was heading into meltdown. It turns out that the faint steam was a significant sign of the impending crisis. Why didn't TEPCO officials realize it? We discovered that TEPCO had not activated the isolation condensers in Reactor 1 for about 40 years. None of the operations staff had ever seen what kind of steam the condensers discharge when they're turned on.
I had never seen a working condenser. Any steam discharge was taken as an affirmation that the condensers were active. No one declared that they were idle. I guess we were unable to provide the kind of information to plant managers that would have pushed them to do something.